new firms must jump through hoops like dolphins at SeaWorld. The lesson for politicians is, no matter what else you do, make things easy, says John Lieber of Thumbtack. This may seem obvious, but a lot of governments don't do it right. Don't require a plumber to spend 2 days at City Hall pulling permits when he could be doing jobs. Too often, state websites are confusing and bureaucrats unhelpful. Dennis Kessler, an accountant in New Jersey, says he usually can't get through on the telephone to the relevant department. When he does, the information is often misleading or incomplete. He recently spent 30 hours trying to help a client change its corporate status without getting a different federal tax identification number, only to discover that this is impossible. Licensing rules are a headache. In theory, they protect the public from incompetence, which is useful if you're hiring a doctor. But increasingly, they protect incumbents from competition. The requirement to have a license raises an occupation's wages by 18%. According to Morris Kleiner and Alan Kruger, two economists. In the 1950s, less than 5% of workers required state licenses. Now 35% do. Some make no sense. Celeste Kelly, a horse lover, began offering horse massage, a subject she had studied privately, in 2006. She charges $55 per session. In 2012, the Arizona State Veterinary Medical Examining Board ordered her to cease and desist or face heavy fines and possible criminal charges. According to the Institute for Justice, the IJ, a libertarian law firm which is suing the board on her behalf, Arizona does not require vets to learn massage, and Ms. Kelly may offer it for free. She simply can't charge for it unless she's a vet. Veterinarians I know think it's ridiculous, she complains. It's their political arm that has crafted legislation to be self-protective. State licensing regimes vary widely. Louisiana requires licenses for 70% of low-wage occupations, according to IJ, including barber, bartender, and cosmetologist. In Wyoming, it is a more modest 24%. In Hawaii, licenses require an average of 724 days of experience and education. In Pennsylvania, 113. Enforcement is uneven too. Changes to regulations have little effect on economic growth in the short run. Cyclical influences such as the state of the housing market or the fortunes of a particular industry, high tech in California, oil in Texas, matter more. But in the long run, business friendliness makes a difference. One study found that states that rank better on indices of taxes, costs and regulations enjoy stronger job growth after filtering out the influence of industry composition and the weather. Globally, countries that rank higher in the World Bank's surveys of the ease of doing business grow faster. Lowering barriers to entry for new businesses gives consumers more choice and cheaper prices. A gourmet food truck fad began in Los Angeles with $2 Korean tacos in 2008 and has thrived because the city is flexible about where such trucks can park. By contrast, Chicago forbids food trucks from operating within 200 feet of a bricks-and-mortar restaurant and requires them to have a GPS to ensure compliance, which makes life very hard for them in the downtown business district. Businesses lobby for lots of things they should not have. Handouts from the taxpayer, handicaps imposed on their rivals. But it is hard to find fault in their plea for simpler rules, swifter bureaucratic decisions, government websites that a normal person can navigate, and officials who actually answer the phone. Clearing away old rules is hard. Their benefits tend to be concentrated, e.g. when they protect incumbents. Their costs dispersed, slightly higher prices affect all consumers, but only a little. States and cities can, however, slow the pace at which new rules proliferate, for example by estimating their economic impact before enacting them. Last year, Iowa's governor vetoed a bill that would have required licenses for drug abuse counselors, and Arizona made life easier for firms operating in multiple cities with separate sales taxes by limiting them to one tax form and one audit. The difficulty is that many rules purport to protect the public from shoddy services, dangerous products, or even death. Even if the cost is high and the risk remote, no politician wants to be accused of compromising public safety. Last year, Mike Pence, Indiana's Republican governor, vetoed the licensing of diabetes educators and anesthesiologist assistants on the grounds the new rules would raise barriers to business and require additional bureaucracy. But a year later, he signed into law a modified version of the measure, minus the extra bureaucracy, but otherwise much the same.
United States. The Supreme Court. A year of drama and dissent. The Roberts Court quietly paves the way for big changes. On June 30th, the final day of its 2013 to 2014 term, the Supreme Court's slim Conservative majority took pains to deny that its last two rulings were radical. In Burwell versus Hobby Lobby, the court decided 5-4 that some employers with religious objections do not have to pay for contraceptives for their staff, despite a law, Obamacare, that tried to make them do so. This ruling will not open the door to a flood of religious objections to American laws by pious employers, insisted Justice Samuel Alito, a conservative. "Oh, yes it will," retorted Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, a liberal, albeit in grander language. The case sparked furious controversy. Yet it may have been the less consequential of the two cases decided that day. The other was Harris versus Quinn, a dispute about unions that turned on the arcane question of how to categorize home healthcare workers. Paola Harris, an Illinois mother, bridled when she was told to pay fees to the Service Employees International Union, or SEIU. Under Illinois law, because Ms. Harris received Medicaid checks for looking after her disabled son, she was deemed a public employee and had no choice but to be represented by SEIU in negotiations with the state. By the narrowest of margins, the court ruled that this was unfair. Mr. Alito observed that Ms. Harris and other home health aides are employed by the people they care for, not by the state, and that they enjoy few of the perks that fully fledged public workers get, such as pensions and ironclad job security. Illinois deems personal assistants to be state employees for one purpose only, collective bargaining, wrote Mr. Alito. He ruled that Ms. Harris was at most a partial public employee, and therefore not obliged to pay the SEIU for representation she did not want. Although the opinion was narrow, Labour leaders saw ominous signs in it. Mr. Alito and some other conservatives would probably have liked to overturn Abood versus Detroit Board of Education, a 1977 precedent holding that public school teachers who do not join a union must still contribute cash to its collective bargaining efforts. Unions see this as a safeguard against free riding. They fret that, if they could, some workers might opt to enjoy the benefits of union-negotiated wages without paying the negotiators. Democrats fear that removing this safeguard would deprive their party of a crucial source of funds. Republicans, who see the cozy ties between Democrats and unions as a conspiracy to fleece taxpayers, would not mind that. For the moment, though, Abood stands. The court's conservative-liberal split was equally raw in McCutcheon versus Federal Election Commission, decided in April. The justices lined up 5-4 to chip away at campaign finance laws. Individuals were previously allowed to donate up to $2,600 to any political candidate during each election cycle, up to a total of $48,600, plus $74,600 to political parties and political action committees. More than that, it was feared, might be corrupting. The court found this an unconvincing rationale for curbing free speech and scrapped the aggregate limits while leaving the per-candidate limits in place. The government may no more restrict how many candidates or causes a donor may support than it may tell a newspaper how many candidates it may endorse, wrote Chief Justice John Roberts. In dissent, Justice Stephen Breyer retorted that the ruling eviscerates our nation's campaign finance laws. Despite such fireworks, the past year has seen more agreement than any for half a century. 2/3 of rulings were unanimous. One area where the justices found it easy to agree was when upholding limits on presidential power. In 3 notable cases, the court ruled 9-0 against the Obama administration. In National Labor Relations Board versus Noel Canning, for example, a Pepsi bottler contested the legitimacy of an NLRB ruling against it. Because President Barack Obama had bypassed the Senate, which is supposed to vet senior appointments, and installed 3 members of the board as recess appointments when the Senate said it was not in recess, Noel Canning sued and won. Mr. Breyer's opinion set new guidelines for recess appointments. The Senate gets to decide when it is in recess, and no appointments may be made during breaks of fewer than 10 days. That could stymie future presidents facing obstructive senates. In Riley versus California, the court swept aside the objections of Mr. Obama's Justice Department and ruled 9-0 that police need a warrant to search a suspect's mobile phone. In Bond versus US, a unanimous court rejected the administration's claim that a woman who smeared mildly toxic chemicals on a love rival's car, causing a minor burn on her thumb, could be prosecuted under a global chemical weapons treaty. The court also grappled with race, religion, and abortion. In McCullen versus Coakley, it ruled unanimously that Massachusetts' 35-foot buffer zone, keeping peaceful protesters away from abortion clinics, infringed free speech rights. Those who harass women seeking an abortion are a different matter. In Chouette versus Coalition to Defend Affirmative Action, the justices said that voters could insist on colour blindness, upholding a ban on racial preferences in public college admissions that Michigan had approved in a ballot initiative. And in Greece versus Galloway, the court ruled 5-4 that a town board could begin meetings with mostly Christian prayers without offending the First Amendment's bar on the establishment of religion. After nullifying the Defense of Marriage Act and permitting same-sex marriage to resume in California a year ago, the justices took a break from gay issues this term. But a year on, with 19 states now recognizing gay marriage and a judge in Kentucky on July 1st joining the stampede to strike down bans on it, the question is sure to return to the Supreme Court soon.
United States. Hobby Lobby. Believe it or not, the Supreme Court sides with religious firms against Obamacare. 2 years ago, the Supreme Court upheld the Affordable Care Act, better known as Obamacare. Their decision on June 30th was less favourable. The court allowed an exception to Obamacare's mandate that firms above a certain size offer their staff insurance that includes free contraception. Rarely has a decision provoked such controversy. Hillary Clinton called it deeply disturbing, though her husband signed the law that underpins it. The case Burwell versus Hobby Lobby Stores, Inc. was brought by 2 Christian families and their businesses. The Greens own Hobby Lobby, a chain of craft shops, and Mardell, a Christian bookstore. The Hands own Conestoga Wood Specialities, a cabinet maker. Obamacare requires firms to offer their workers all contraceptives approved by the Food and Drug Administration. The Greens and Hands believe that 4 of those contraceptives, including the morning after pill, are abortifacients, since they may keep a fertilized egg from implanting in the uterine wall. The issue was not whether these highly debatable beliefs are valid, but the circumstances under which a religious objection may trump a federal law. The Constitution protects the right to the free exercise of religion. A 1993 law, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, further requires that the government shall not substantially burden a person's exercise of religion unless doing so is the least restrictive way to advance a compelling government interest. By 5 votes to 4, the court ruled that obliging closely held firms with religious owners to pay for their employees' contraceptives violates that principle. The government had argued that Hobby Lobby could not claim to have religious beliefs because it is a for-profit corporation. While the Greens are persons who exercise religion, there is a critical separation between the Greens and the corporation they have been elected to create, the government's lawyers insisted. A company has rights and obligations that differ from those of its owners. That includes being subject to Obamacare's employer mandate, they argued. The court's conservative justices disagreed. Protecting the free exercise rights of corporations like Hobby Lobby, Conestoga and Mardell protects the religious liberty of the humans who own and control these companies, wrote Justice Samuel Alito. If Hobby Lobby refused to cover the 4 contraceptives, it faced fines of up to $475 million a year, which Mr. Alito said clearly counted as a substantial burden. And the government had other, less onerous ways to provide contraception, he argued. For example, it could pay for contraception itself or include for-profit companies in an accommodation already made for non-profit religious organizations such as Catholic universities. Under that accommodation, insurers cover the cost of contraception without raising prices for employers or their workers. Mr. Alito insisted that the ruling was a narrow one, applying only to closely held firms under very specific circumstances. It is unclear how the government will now ensure that women with religious employers obtain free contraception. The accommodation may not be viable. Its legality is being challenged by separate suits. Some women may have to pay for their own contraceptives. Since the cost of company-provided insurance comes largely out of wages, many women with employer coverage are already paying some of the cost of their contraceptives. The ruling could make it harder to enforce the Obamacare mandate that employers offer health insurance, a mandate that has already been delayed. Many firms are closely held, including some that employ tens of thousands of workers. These companies may now seek exemptions from other parts of the mandate. On July 1st, the Supreme Court ordered lower courts to revisit objections to a broader set of contraceptives, in addition to the 4 raised by Hobby Lobby. In future, companies might challenge Obamacare's mandate to cover immunizations, blood transfusions, or medicines derived from pigs, though none has yet done so. In dissent, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg said the decision was of startling breadth. Companies, she wrote, can opt out of any law, saving only tax laws, they judge incompatible with their sincerely held religious beliefs. United States.
Puerto Rico's debt crisis. Neither a state nor independent. How a territory falls between bankruptcy regimes.
Puerto Rico has put on a brave face during its year-long debt crisis. But on June 28th, Alejandro Garcia Padilla, the governor, made a belated concession to reality by signing a law establishing a de facto bankruptcy regime for state-owned enterprises. With the Puerto Rico Electric Power Authority, or PREPA, a cash-strapped utility teetering on the brink of default, the new system may face its first test soon. Puerto Rico's woes stem from a mix of structural weaknesses, external shocks, and self-inflicted wounds. As an overseas American territory, it uses the dollar and the national minimum wage. That makes labor costly and exports uncompetitive. From 1976 to 2006, firms on the island were exempt from federal tax on their local profits. But once that carve-out expired, the economy fell into an 8-year recession. And after Detroit went bankrupt, investors fled risky municipal bonds, which raised Puerto Rico's financing costs. However, the government also bears its own share of the blame. It has spent too little on infrastructure and too much on pensions. And it has grossly mismanaged PREPA, which still generates 65% of its power using expensive fuel oil. Not only did the company cost the state $276 million in 2013, but its high prices serve as a tax on most economic activity. Mr. Garcia Padilla has tried to compensate with austerity. On July 1st, he signed a balanced budget that cut discretionary spending by 8%. But Puerto Rico's public finances have regularly underperformed official forecasts. The government insists that it cannot default because its constitution gives debt payments first priority. However, this only applies to its general obligation and guaranteed bonds. The remaining public debt is backed by specific revenues like highway tolls or, in PREPA's case, electric bills. And the $800 million of bank credit lines PREPA uses to buy fuel come due in August. Unless it can renegotiate quickly, it will either default or turn out the lights. No one knows what would happen then. Puerto Rican state agencies fall in a gap in America's bankruptcy code. They are excluded from the regimes both for local governments and private firms. As a result, missed payments would probably set off a whirlwind of litigation. To forestall this risk, the government instituted a new insolvency system for its companies. It gives them 9 months to negotiate a settlement acceptable to holders of 75% of their debt. If the parties cannot agree, local courts would impose a solution. Investors saw the law as evidence that PREPA was set to restructure its $8.6 billion of liabilities and have dumped its bonds. But PREPA's two biggest creditors, the mutual fund firms Franklin Templeton and Oppenheimer Funds, have challenged the law, arguing that the Constitution gives Congress exclusive control over bankruptcy. If they win, it might boost calls to change Puerto Rico's status. As the 51st state, its state-owned firms would be covered by the Federal Bankruptcy Code. As an independent country, it could set its own rules. Under the status quo, it may be stuck with neither.
United States. Rhode Island politics. Freshening New England's armpit. The ex-mayor who inspired a gangster musical returns.
There was little doubt what the answer would be when Vincent Buddy Cianci, Providence's longest-serving mayor-turned-radio host, asked his listeners whether he should run again. The response, as he put it, was a love fest. Mr. Cianci declared his candidacy on his show on June 25th. "The fire still burns," he said. Mr. Cianci's previous stints as mayor ended badly. In 1984, after a decade on the job, he had to resign when he was convicted of assaulting a man with a cigarette, an ashtray, and a log. In 1990, he convinced voters to give him another shot and did much to spruce up the city centre. But in 2002, he was brought down by a federal racketeering probe that landed him in prison for nearly 5 years. To add insult to injury, a musical based on his life premiered off-Broadway in 2003, featuring catchy numbers like The Ass You Have to Kiss Today and The Armpit of New England, an unkind reference to Providence. Mr. Cianci lost his liberty and his toupee, but he bounced back, writing a book, Politics and Pasta, launching his own marinara sauce and using his radio program to discuss the city's concerns. Alas, his devoted listeners cannot all vote. Many live in the suburbs, and the city is much changed. Many of Mr. Cianci's supporters have died or moved. Latinos now make up nearly 40% of the population. We have a much larger population of young artists and professionals who have little sympathy for old-school ward politics, but who, with many Latinos as neighbors, live exactly in Cianci's former strongholds, says Anthony Affinier, a political scientist at Providence College. Asked if Mr. Cianci should run again, Michael Townsend, an artist, says, "No, no, no, absolutely not." Mr. Cianci, an ex-Republican, is running as an independent. His prospects depend on who his Democratic opponent is, says Wendy Schiller of Brown University. Brett Smiley, a quirky technocrat, would grab some of his union supporters. Mr. Cianci was generous to the police and firefighters when he was mayor. Jorge Elorza, a Latino, would win Latinos, whom Mr. Cianci courted during his last run. Even Mr. Cianci's critics concede that he loves Providence and wants it to do well. But his reputation could deter businesses from moving to the city, which was once known as the beehive of industry. Not all comebacks are welcome.
United States. Porkfest and the Free State Project. Anarchists get organized. The plot to liberate New Hampshire. A young man in a leather loincloth saunters past a woman dressed like Alice in Wonderland. The tang of pot wafts through the air, and a small remote-operated drone buzzes overhead. Bought it in China, says the proud owner. I'd use it to follow chicks, marvels one chap. Guns are everywhere. Bitcoin is the currency of choice. The Porcupine Freedom Festival, which ended on June 29th, saw more than 1,500 libertarians and anarchists descend on Lancaster, New Hampshire. The event's mascot is a porcupine, which, though well-armed, only causes pain when attacked. New Hampshire is a natural stamping ground for freedom lovers. It has low taxes, lean bureaucracy, and some of the loosest gun laws in America. Grown-ups can ride around without seatbelts or motorcycle helmets. The right to rebel when public liberty is manifestly endangered. United States. Clothing optional holidays. Nudists on cruises. The right to bear arms, legs, and other body parts.
Americans are, on the whole, much more squeamish about public nudity than Europeans. Even a toddler frolicking naked on a sunny beach attracts disapproving frowns. No federal law bars public nudity, but plenty of state and local rules do. Last summer, for example, New York began enforcing a state law banning public nudity, nixing the state's last remaining nudist haunt on Fire Island. Only a handful of beaches in America officially allow folks to bob away in the buff. Yet as National Nude Recreation Week begins on July 7th, American naturists are grinning and bearing it. Tourism, by the tan line averse, generates more than $440 million a year, according to the American Association for Nude Recreation, or AANR. Early nudists may have been happy gathering at campsites, but today they like to be pampered. Of the more than 250 nudist and clothing-optional resorts and clubs sprinkled around the country, the small mom-and-pop operations are folding, while the survivors are going upmarket, says Susan Weaver of AANR. The Cypress Cove nudist resort and spa in Florida, for example, began in the 1960s as basically a lakefront with a windscreen, says Ted Hadley, its owner. Now it is a 300-acre resort with hot tubs, restaurants and a spa. We're busier than a coot, says Donna Daniels of Castaways Travel, which arranges nudist cruises and other vacations. Except for a dip in business in 2008, the 30-year-old company has been growing steadily and surged 20% last year. Nude travel is a tremendous niche, says Nancy Timon of Bare Necessities, another nude cruise firm. Its first cruise in 1990 involved 36 passengers on a boat in the Bahamas. Last year, it chartered a ship big enough to carry 3,000 on the Caribbean. One reason for the rise in luxury nudist travel is that customers are aging. Nudists tend to be older, richer and whiter, pinker, than the national average, and they travel mostly in romantic pairs, says Bob Morton of the Naturist Action Committee, an advocacy group. Many are not full-time naturists, but think a clothing-optional holiday sounds fun. Some 18% of American leisure travellers say they are game for it, according to a 2014 survey by MMGY Global, a marketing firm. There is still plenty of demand for public nudist beaches. Fallover Beach in Miami, the country's largest, lures more than 1.3 million visitors each year, many of them cottontails, or white-bummed novices, says Shirley Mason, the beach's founder. They spend over $1 billion a year, according to Miami's Convention and Visitors Bureau. Ms. Mason is now raising capital to create 3 new clothing-optional resorts near the beach. But there are few public beaches like Fallover left. This is the challenge facing the nudist travel industry. Few people know they want to do it until they try it, perhaps by stumbling on an inviting beach of cottontails. Or, as Mr. Morton says of the joys of skinny dipping, I can't explain it if you haven't experienced it, and if you have, I don't need to.
United States, Lexington. Call him Queen Bee. The myth of an omnipotent presidency makes it harder to get a competent one.
For anyone who doubts that America is the land of the free, the ability of the Supreme Court to turn a question posed by a Pepsi distributor into a ruling that restricts presidential power ought to be reassuring. In NLRB versus Noel Canning, the court decided on June 26 that Barack Obama had acted unconstitutionally when he appointed people to the board of a federal agency while the Senate was technically still in session. That the decision was unanimous must have stung the constitutional law professor in the White House as much as it delighted Republicans. The day before the court's decision, John Boehner, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, announced plans to sue the President for overreaching his authority and for enforcing laws selectively. We elected a president, Mr. Boehner wrote to his colleagues. We didn't elect a monarch or king. If